The PS1 is, for many, still one of the most iconic and important consoles of all time, ushering in the era where 3D gaming came into its own and video games started to transition from a niche hobby into a major entertainment medium. Some sources put the total amount of games in the PS1 library at nearly 8,000 titles, roughly 1,300 of which were released in North America. It's practically impossible to play every game on the PS1, and I'm not even sure you'd want to, but most of us are still familiar with the console's greatest hits. Games like Resident Evil, Gran Turismo, Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, the list goes on. But the PS1 library is a lot more than those iconic and instantly recognizable titles. Many of the PS1's best and most original games are titles that, for one reason or another, flew under most players' radar, and now have a cult following as original, forward-thinking experiences ahead of their time. So, in no particular order, here are 20 of the most underrated PS1 games. An early hidden gem in the PlayStation library that surprisingly still holds its own against several other later shooters on the console, Loaded is over the top in all the best ways. It features character designs and story from comic legends such as Preacher's Garth Ennis and 2080's Greg Staples, an iconic 90s alternative soundtrack from innovative UK band Pop Will Eat Itself, and its gameplay is pure, unadulterated, gory mayhem. While most levels do boil down to simply finding a series of color-coded keys while mowing down waves of enemies, it's a satisfying arcade-style gameplay loop that's only more fun in co-op. Altogether, Loaded is a nice little slice of mid-90s nostalgia that stands the test of time as an action-packed time capsule. Konami released the surprisingly good Soul of the Samurai to almost no fanfare despite Tenchu's acclaim a year prior, and it's a shame more players aren't familiar with this PS1 hidden gem. In Soul of the Samurai, players can choose between the Ronin Kotaro or his shinobi counterpart Lin, which somewhat transforms the experience. Unlike Tenchu, which discouraged open confrontation with enemies in favor of stealth, Soul of the Samurai is a violent and brutal game where combat takes center stage, and it has a fittingly dark and heavy story to accompany the on-screen carnage that's just as engaging as the gameplay. As someone who fell in love with the TRPG genre thanks to Final Fantasy Tactics, I spent many years tracking down all the best turn-based tactics games I could get my hands on. One that never seems to get enough love, despite TRPG fans shouting its praises from the rooftops, is Konami's Vandal Hearts. Vandal Hearts treads similar territory as PS1-era genre standard-bearers like Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics, but it whittles away many of the elements and mechanics players have come to expect from the RPG side of TRPGs by focusing squarely on one thing: combat. And when the combat is as satisfying and kinetic as it is in Vandal Hearts, it's easy to understand why. Throw in a soundtrack by legendary Suikoden composer Miki Higashino, and you have a certified PS1 cult classic. Just a few years before Shinji Mikami would come along with God Hand to revolutionize the aging beat-em-up formula, Italian studio Nap's team delivered a commendable attempt with Gekido. Many of the genres that had previously been ultra-successful in arcades and on 3rd and 4th generation consoles suddenly fell out of vogue during the 5th generation, mostly thanks to changing tastes and technological advancements making more immersive, cinematic experiences possible. One of the primary victims of this trend was the beat-em-up, but that didn't stop developers from trying their hand at replicating the genre's past success in 3D, which Gekido does in spirit, despite it mostly going unnoticed by the PS1's mainstream audience. While the character models and environments in Gekido are 3D, the action all takes place on a 2D side-scrolling plane, and the combat is fittingly complex and visceral. It's not without its jank, but it is smoother and paced better than similar games like Fighting Force. Speaking of genres that suddenly fell out of vogue in the 5th generation, the shoot-'em-up, scrolling shooter, shooting game, shmup, whatever your preferred nomenclature, was another victim of changing tastes in the mid-90s. One of the first shmups on the PS1 is Philosoma, which is typically outshined by other noteworthy genre entries on the console like Gradius Gaiden or R-Type Delta, but it's probably the genre's greatest hidden gem on the platform. While most shmups are either horizontally or vertically scrolling, Philosoma is both, and its top-notch presentation, including some impressive visuals for how early it was released in the PS1's lifespan, and its more accessible challenge, solidify it even further as a must-play for genre fans. Long before Nintendo wowed players with its quirky collection of addictive minigames in 2003's WarioWare Incorporated, Polygon Magic released one of the most quintessentially offbeat and hilarious video games ever made with the irreverent minigame collection Incredible Crisis. In Incredible Crisis, players get to live a day in the life of an average, totally normal Japanese family. Except, as the title implies, things start to go wrong in spectacular fashion, and it's up to you to prevent the titular crisis by guiding each member of the family through zany mini-games that span an impressive range of gameplay genres. For those who have played Incredible Crisis, they know it to be one of the most unique and enjoyable games on the PS1, and, depending on who you ask, it might just be the console's most underrated classic. Despite its shockingly low sales figures, there seems to be a fairly sizable contingent of PS1 players who have fond memories of UEP Systems' inventive hack-and-slash shooter hybrid, Rising Zan: The Samurai Gunman. Funnily enough, UEP Systems would make a name for itself on the PS1 thanks to the Cool Borders franchise, and Rising Zan marks the one and only game the studio released that was outside the extreme sports genre. You might guess that it's the studio's only action game thanks to its somewhat stiff controls and simplistic gameplay, but its writing, soundtrack, and absurd blend of Tarantino-style theatrics and Japanese romanticism of the American Wild West speak to a title destined to be a cult classic that punches well above its weight. As the saying goes, hindsight is 20/20. While today, a lot of critics and fans look back fondly on Silicon Knight's Legacy of Kain: Blood Omen as a groundbreaking, narrative-driven action RPG, there's no denying that the original game in the Legacy of Kain series was far more obscure than its sequel, Soul Reaver. Still, that fond recollection of Blood Omen is well-deserved, because it's a game well ahead of its time that is undoubtedly one of the PS1's more underrated hidden gems. While its combat and RPG mechanics aren't too different from what players saw in action RPGs on the SNES, Blood Omen's gothic atmosphere, mature story, and cinematic presentation cement it as one of the best vampire games ever made, and a title that would have only been possible on new 5th generation hardware. Most players are familiar with SingleTrack for its iconic car combat game Twisted Metal, but the studio is also responsible for one of the PS1's early great flight sim games with Warhawk. While flight combat games are mostly non-existent these days, outside of maybe Ace Combat, they were all the rage at the time of Warhawk's launch, and Warhawk was a great addition to the PS1's early library in the West, to showcase what the new console was capable of. Most importantly, Warhawk embodies the more arcadey style of flight combat games, eschewing realism in favor of pure fun and frantic action, just like SingleTrack's legendary Twisted Metal series. Originally a Sega Saturn title, Treasure's Silhouette Mirage would make its way to the PS1 courtesy of Western publisher Working Designs. However, the title largely went unnoticed in North America thanks to side-scrolling run-and-guns mostly being out of style by the time of its localization. But, as many run-and-gun and shmup fans are known to do, Silhouette Mirage's fanbase would help to raise the game to cult status thanks to its excellent arcade-style action and similarities to two of the greatest Treasure games, Gunstar Heroes and Radiant Silvergun. Silhouette Mirage blends elements from across Treasure's experience as a talented arcade developer, including a novel polarity mechanic that almost foreshadows the developer's work on Ikaruga, and its critical reviews and commercial success do not do its gameplay an ounce of justice. Another Working Designs gem to make its way to the PS1 in North America is Matrix Software's Alundra. Equal parts Secret of Mana and The Legend of Zelda, Alundra filled a very specific niche that the PS1 hadn't really captured up until its release, the classic action-adventure game. Given Matrix Software's pedigree as the developers of the excellent Zelda-like Landstalker on the Genesis, Alundra's brilliance should come as no surprise, and its phenomenal story, presentation, and puzzles still help it shine as one of the best 2D action-adventure games nearly a quarter century away from its release. It would eventually get a sequel with Alundra 2, but the original Alundra is, for my money, the superior game and one of the greatest hidden gems in the PS1 library. Today we know Insomniac Games as one of the most important Sony first-party studios, thanks to massive hits like Ratchet & Clank and Marvel's Spider-Man. But the studio's very first game for the original PlayStation is far lesser known. Releasing toward the end of 1996, Disruptor was one of the first original first-person shooter titles on the PS1, and it's a commendable effort for the console. Most console players of the era opted for the Nintendo 64 for their first-person shooter fix, thanks to its 4 controller ports and iconic classics like GoldenEye 007 and Turok. But Disruptor proved that Sony's 5th-gen console could hold its own as a home for quality, story-driven first-person shooters, and it's obvious to see early hints at Insomniac's future greatness in its gameplay. Shiny Entertainment spent the mid-90s riding high on the runaway success of the Earthworm Jim games, so it should come as no surprise that, for its next title, Shiny chose not to reinvent the wheel, but to refine it with Wild 9. Another action platformer with some wacky physics and an irreverent, goofy sense of humor underpinning every moment of its gameplay, Wild 9's titular mechanic is the main character's rig, a sort of gravity tether that players use to grip enemies and slam them into the environment in brutal, yet hilarious, fashion. And as you might expect from the same developer behind Earthworm Jim, Wild 9 backs up its one-of-a-kind style and humor with some suitably solid platforming and combat. Not to be confused with the infinitely more popular Spider-Man PS1 games from Neversoft, Spider, the video game, is an incredibly underrated action platformer that sees players take on the role of a cybernetic spider. One of the game's strongest suits is its level design, which turns everyday locations into grueling gauntlets for survival as players fend off insect enemies and brave perilous platforming challenges to reach each stage's goal. Combat is also way better than it needs to be in Spider, with players able to equip and swap out up to 10 different weapons on their cybernetic arachnid's 8 limbs. Is it all a bit silly? Yes. Does that only add to its greatness as one of the PS1's best cult classics? Absolutely. While the original Parasite Eve is commonly cited as one of the greatest RPGs on the PS1, its sequel tends to be mostly forgotten by comparison. Part of the mixed reception to Parasite Eve II boils down to its embracing of more traditional survival horror gameplay at the expense of losing many of the original's RPG mechanics. That said, it's still a competent survival horror experience. Doing away with the RPG-style ATB bar and turn-based combat transforms Parasite Eve II into a title that shares more in common with Resident Evil, and with Square's budget backing its visuals, story, and presentation, Parasite Eve II stands out as one of the better survival horror games on the PS1 to not bear the Resident Evil or Silent Hill name. Judging from the comments on our video chronicling the best PS1 RPGs, it seems like it's safe to say that Legend of Legaia still has a very dedicated fanbase. In many ways, Legend of Legaia is the RPG fan's RPG, a game destined to be a cult classic thanks to its release in proximity to many other better-known, higher-profile releases. But, like most cult classics do, Legend of Legaia continues to resonate with new players thanks to longtime fans continuing to sing its praises, and it's surprising to see how underrated of a title it is considering how forward-thinking many of its mechanics are. The star of Legend of Legaia is absolutely its atypical combat system, which separates attacks into 4 quadrants, high, low, left, and right, and allows players to execute devastating combos that help keep each encounter feeling fresh. Of the many Resident Evil clones on the PS1, perhaps the most underrated of them all is Fear Effect. Part Resident Evil and part old-school point-and-click adventure game, Fear Effect rubbed a lot of players the wrong way thanks to its instant-death, trial-and-error puzzles. But for those of us who grew up playing the classic Sierra adventure titles on MS-DOS, Fear Effect combined the best parts of those games with newer survival horror gameplay in a thrilling horror story inspired by Chinese mythology. The best part, if you missed out on this excellent game back in the day, Fear Effect is finally about to come to PC and modern consoles thanks to limited-run games. Whoopee Camp's Tomba is an excellent action platformer with some surprising Metroidvania elements thanks to its non-linear structure and ability to improve the titular character with some light RPG progression. Along with Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Tomba is one of the few Metroidvania titles on the PS1 ahead of the genre's renaissance as part of the 6th generation. And it also happens to be an incredibly fun platformer whose development pedigree, which includes Capcom's Tokuro Fujiwara, the mind behind classics like Ghosts and Goblins, Bionic Commando, and many, many more, shines through in its excellent visuals, earworm of a soundtrack, and airtight gameplay. One of the best shmups on the PS1 also happens to be Square's only attempt at the genre, 1997's Einhänder. Released during a time when Final Fantasy VII's success gave Square enough capital to take risks and get experimental with its game design, Einhänder is a first attempt at a genre that comes off feeling like it was made by one of its most legendary and prolific developers. An instant classic and masterpiece on par with the greatest gems from both the arcades and the iconic genre library of shooting games on the Sega Saturn. It's no wonder that Square never attempted making another shmup given how poorly Einhänder sold, but its excellent understanding of genre fundamentals positions the title as both one of the PS1's most underrated games and one of the shmup genre's hidden gems. A full decade before the studio would blow the lid off the stagnating survival horror genre with Dead Space, EA Redwood Shores produced one of the PS1's all-time greats with Future Cop LAPD. But despite Future Cop being one of the most fun and satisfying shooters on the PlayStation, players mostly ignored the game thanks to its arcade look and more simplistic gameplay in comparison to the more cinematic games that were starting to take shape on the console. However, thanks to the clarity provided by retrospective reflection, it's now obvious to just about anyone who plays Future Cop LAPD that it's one of the best PS1 games and a criminally overlooked title that blends EA's gameplay from Desert or Jungle Strike with a power fantasy straight out of RoboCop. With thousands of games to sift through in the PS1 library, it's practically impossible to list every single underrated game on the console. These are our 20 picks for PS1 hidden gems that are worth revisiting today, but we're interested to hear your thoughts. Let us know your choices for the PS1's most underrated games in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.